All right, camera's rolling. And whenever you're ready.
Okay, is this a good volume? Or do I need to be louder? People. Okay, cool. Hello. My name is Jules Keelblock, and my topic of research is discrepancies of the portrayal of recycling in children's media. So let's start off with some basic background on plastic recycling specifically in the U.S. Only about 5 to 9% of plastic waste in the U.S. is actually recycled. 93% of U.S. adults overestimate this number, including a third of U.S. adults thinking that over half of plastic waste is recycled. So there's we can see already there's a significant gap between public perception of the effectiveness of plastic recycling and what the actuality is. There are a few contributing factors to why this number is so low. A lot of plastic waste ends up going to landfills or being incinerated or exported to other countries, even when it is put in recycling bins by public people or by citizens. This happens because not all types of plastic actually have viable recycling systems, and even fewer of them are able to be recycled in a way that is financially feasible for most municipalities that are running recycling centers, because it is more expensive to reprocess this plastic than it is to create new forms of the same type of plastic. In addition, plastic in the process of recycling does lose some of its structural integrity, so it cannot be infinitely recycled. At a certain point, it does have to be disposed of because it cannot be used for its intended purposes. So there are 7 different types of plastic, as shown up here. Numbers 1 and 2 are the most commonly recycled, which are recycled in most municipalities. They make things like plastic bottles, jugs, things like that, and they are commonly recycled. The rest, however, are rarely, if ever, recycled. Some just don't have any practical uses. Number 7, other, contains actually a wide variety of plastics that cannot be specifically, they cannot be even melted together because it contains a variety of actual different structures within the plastics. Number 5 is also notable because it's what is used to make plastic like grocery bags, and those are infrequently recycled, though they are on an upward trend. But also many of the bags that end up in boxes to be recycled, once again, do not actually make it through recycling centers and into something new. So with all that in mind, with this clear discrepancy, my question is, where does this overperception actually originate for the difference in how adults tend to perceive recycling and what the actuality is? So there are a few different background things to consider here. One of the big ones is that companies which produce plastic products obviously have an interest in the public believing they're sustainable, and therefore produce media that pushes people to think that plastic recycling specifically is significantly beneficial. As a side note, other types of recycling, metal, glass, and paper, are more effective overall and have a greater percentage of materials actually reused, which is why I'm not choosing to focus on them in this presentation. The ones that get to my analysis, they will be touched on because of the topics I ended up analyzing. However, the thing I wanted to look at specifically was the possibility of childhood media impacting these adult views. Children specifically are very likely to believe information that's presented to them if it's presented A, with confidence, and B, from a source that they already have built trust in. And this can definitely come from media that is presented to them in the form of TV shows or from teachers. And then past that, recycling is not something that most people are frequently made to think deeply about in their lives. There's often very little to challenge beliefs that may have been formed by children consuming this media. Because of this, I chose to analyze children's TV shows and specifically how they outline recycling. So I chose to look at specific episodes of various TV shows aimed at children to see what kind of framing was used in them. By noting word choice and phrasing that indicates framing of positives, framing of any drawbacks or limitations, and how in depth recycling is actually shown. I also took note of other types of waste management besides landfills, because those are obviously the most common and the most problematic option that were discussed, including reuse or reduction of waste in the first place. I chose shows through a mix of looking at their popularity. I used a website called Flix Patrol, which looks at the most streamed shows on a variety of streaming services, including Netflix, Paramount Plus, Disney Plus, and a lot of others that allowed me to get some of the most popular shows up here. But I also chose shows that are specifically designed to be educational or used more in educational settings to look at better portrayal of these shows. So a few quick statistics about these shows. The years that they were first released ranged all the way from 1996 to 2023, but they skewed towards the past 10 years or so. So more of them are more modern shows that would be teaching current kids. Roughly one third of the shows that I originally actually chose to analyze ended up not being suitable for the analysis I was trying to do in this, in my research, because I primarily chose by looking at summaries on wikis for these shows, which are not always considered the most reliable, but have the advantage of having significantly more depth than any summaries that providers of these show actually had accessible to the public, and they are generally pretty reliable. And they did ultimately, as I was going through, align with the events of the shows, and I also looked at transcripts. However, that sometimes meant that I found recycling mentioned in these, but it was too much of a passing issue to really be analyzed in a specific episode, or shows were not targeted at the audience that I originally believed, either if they were shows that were intended for children older, more like teenagers or older children, then they weren't necessarily suitable for what I was looking at. The target ages of the shows I was looking at ranged from preschoolers, roughly like 2 to 5 years old, to late elementary school, 9 to 12 or 11 years old. And I found that shows with a larger target audience, with an older target audience, did tend to have more depth, but there was definitely some exceptions that I will be talking about later. So what are some big trends? Some big trends I found. Well, children's shows didn't have an overwhelmingly positive framing of recycling. Obviously, this makes sense. It is certainly better than simply disposing of waste in the landfill. It allows for at least some use, some reuse, and less trash going on the planet. However, it does in some ways take away from the fact that there are still negative aspects to the current recycling system. They also tend to lump plastics together into one recyclable group. This was true most notably in the episode of The Magic School Bus that I watched, which specifically did choose to portray a recycling plant, but melted basically every plastic item they could find into one just mass that realistically would never be able to work, and it also then kind of negates the idea that there is a limit to the types of plastics that can actually be recycled. They tend to imply recycling is an infinite cycle. As I said before, in the process of plastic recycling, the structures of plastics are broken down, so they cannot be infinitely done, and therefore reduction of plastic use is an important first step. And they also tend to explore reuse as an equal alternative to recycling. Having reuse reuse is definitely very important because because it's still, given the things discussed previously, reduces reduces waste in the long term. There were some interesting notes. One episode of the show Cyber Chase specifically discussed waste management issues, albeit briefly, such as exporting waste to other areas or countries to avoid it in specifically more populated areas, and also discussed how this is problematic because it still leads to widely dispersed waste. As I mentioned earlier too, shows with older target audiences from middle to late elementary school tended to be more in-depth. One episode of Side Girls talked about the economic side of recycling plastics. As I said, a lot of things are not recycled because there is no market for them, and so it's not financially viable to do so. And that was the only show that was the show with the oldest target audience that I had, and the only show that touched upon topics like that. And Magic School Bus and Cyber Chase were also both notable for how much they went into depth about their recycling. However, a notable exception to that was actually the episode of Sesame Street that I watched called The Recycling Fairy, which talked about recycling, talked about reuse, and visited a recycling center. This is a show that is oriented towards preschoolers, so noting that reuse is also very valuable, and doing things such as exploring an actual recycling center in which it's noted that if things cannot be properly sorted, they will end up going to a landfill, is something that I found to be quite remarkable given the young target audience of the show. So ultimately, I found that children's shows, while having depth in their discussions, show a positive bias in regards to recycling that is comparable to trends seen in U.S. adults. So I should note that only some of them actually have depth in their discussions, especially I talked about Sesame Street being a good example of a show oriented towards preschoolers. All the other ones I looked at, including Cocomelon and Little Angel, which are two of the most popular things, are very simplistic in their presentations and very extremely positive. Other shows such as Curious George were also and Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood were also positive to a lesser extent, but still obviously lacked depth. So from here, we can clearly see that children's shows should reflect the discrepancy that that is seen in American adults' views of recycling. So the question is, how will this impact future research? I first want to look at how this topic can be expanded on. I was limited. I analyzed 9 episodes of varying. The 9 episodes of varying shows made it into my final analysis. I viewed roughly 15, but as I said before, not all of them actually fit the structure of analysis that I was looking to use. So that was obviously a relatively limited scope. Broader television analysis could expand to more recycling-specific episodes, as well as looking at more casual mentions of recycling throughout shows. A big example of this that came up as I was doing my research that I couldn't viably fit in was actually the show Paw Patrol. One of the main characters is a dog who drives a recycling truck, has a lot of reuse, but it's throughout minor appearances in the show over time. So it's difficult to analyze that given my time constraints on this project. There's also obviously research on media that is more oriented towards teenagers and adults. I did not touch on this. That was not the scope of my project, but it obviously helps close the gap on understanding why American adults have an overly positive perception of recycling and overestimate its effectiveness. And there's also, of course, long-term impact. Because a lot of these shows were more modern, the kids who have watched them are still kids. And because I am doing an AP research project as a senior in high school, I cannot be looking at views that children have in the long term because I had a few months to complete this project. So future research could look at how children who view these types of shows once they grow into adults view recycling. In terms of improvements of portrayal, expressing limits to recycling while still displaying positivity is a big thing. Multiple shows show that this was possible in that they talked about plastics and that couldn't be recycled while also still looking at reuse and recycling what could be recycled, and still making it clear that recycling was a better option than throwing everything away. Plastic alternatives alongside recycling, be it different materials, glass or metal, which are more recyclable, or more long-term reusable materials alongside recycling is also a big thing. That is in some but not all of these episodes. And exploration of the different types of plastic, what is recyclable commonly and what is not, is also a big improvement that could be made in a broader sense to improve the portrayal in media of children, the portrayal in children's media of plastic and other recycling. Thank you. Your sources, image sources are located in the speaker notes of my slideshow if you need those.
Okay, first question. What was the most important source of information you found while conducting your research, and why was it important to your research process?
I'm going to say, I think the website Flix Patrol, which I touched on briefly, but it was a huge factor in gauging popularity of various TV shows, which was important to me because it meant I would analyze shows that are reaching a large audience of children currently. So seeing the views on various shows really helped me. And while some of them were still chosen for educational purposes rather than this popularity, it helped me get a good scope of what was actually being watched by children and what would make sense to analyze.
So Jules sort of touched upon this, but I'm supposed to ask you a question. What additional questions emerged during your research? And based upon your recent experience, what advice would you give to other researchers who might choose to investigate those questions?
As I talked about before, there are plenty of expansions that could come up. How is it portrayed in broader television? Which I think I would recommend. There were things that I discovered too late to really actually, I think, implement them, like in using transcripts of shows effectively instead of watching through them. That can be significantly helpful, especially when you're looking for more minor points, as well as just planning for greater amounts of time to watch shows. And in general, I would recommend to anyone who is continuing to look into this I would also say that it would be a good idea to look into a more quantitative method of analysis. That was something that I struggled to actually create during this. And while I still definitely gained valuable data, I think that being able to successfully structure something quantitative would have helped more clearly present some of my findings.
Thank you.
Okay.
Think about the initial curiosity that led to your inquiry. What other areas of inquiry might the same curiosity lead to?
Obviously, there are related areas of inquiry, such as how things are portrayed to adults, but I think it's also, I think another and more separate area of inquiry that I was very heavily considering was research into why viable alternatives have not been able to gain significant popularity for recycling, or like why materials haven't been able to gain popularity, why recycling of plastics numbers 3, 2 through 7 have been made popular. There are a lot of topics in this area that you can branch out into.
Any other questions from the panelists? Any questions from the audience? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Was I over time?